Today I want to go over the joiner, but before we do that, we need to talk about shop safety. So, remove any jewelry, secure any loose clothing, be sure you're wearing closed-toed shoes, and most importantly, be wearing safety glasses. Let's get started. So, the reason we use the joiner is the lumber we buy here is surfaced on two sides, usually the widest sides, but on the edges, it's still rough, and it's labeled S2S lumber, so surface two sides. The joiner's job is to take this and flatten it out so that when we go to use it, you can then use it to put two pieces together, or when we go to the table saw, we have a nice straight edge to run against the fence. If you don't do that before you use the table saw when you go to run it, because the table saw only wants to cut in a straight line, it will try and follow whatever this edge is. And so if this edge is bowed, you have to, the table saw will try and turn a corner, and it doesn't work very well. It'll bind up, it'll burn, it'll smoke. It may even kick back at you, which is dangerous. So to do that, we're going to set up the machine and flatten out this edge. Before making any adjustments to the joiner, you want to make sure that the power is turned off and that the cutter head is standing still. Number one is come down here and verify this depth of cut. It should be set to be about a 16th, not more than a 16th of an inch. If you have, it will cut much more than that, but if you have it set way down here, one, it's much more difficult to push through, and two, it removes a lot of material very quickly. 4 passes at 1/8 of an inch, you've lost a 1/2 an inch off the edge of that board. So if you're making mistakes, you wind up using a lot more material. If you leave it set to that 16th, you have then 8 passes to get to a 1/2 inch, and generally you can get it done in 2 or 3. So it might take a little bit longer, but it's definitely easier to use. Now, before running a piece of wood through the joiner, there's a couple other things that you need to look for. First, look down your edge. Make sure that there's no rocks, screws, or nails sticking out, or even if you've glued pieces together and there's excess glue. If there's excess glue, scrape it off. But rocks and nails and anything really hard, even some knots, can damage the cutter head. And as I was looking at this, our cutter head right here, if you can see, there's a dent in the cutter head. Now, if you find that, that was caused by something that was too hard being run over the joiner. So, you can move the fence in and out depending on the width of the piece. If we were going to run something really wide through there, we'd have to replace the joiner knives, but for today we're going to move this over and then tighten this down with the knob up on top. The fence on the joiner is adjustable, but it does operations that we don't really normally do here in our class. So make sure that you can always double check that it is at 90 degrees, and you can check that with the speed square. And so the joiner fence is 90 degrees to the table. And then you want to make sure as you're running your piece that you stay square against the fence and flat on the table. This long piece is the table, but the table is actually split into 2 pieces. There's the in-feed table and the out-feed table. The in-feed table is adjusted by lowering this. So the in-feed table sets lower than the top of the knife on the cutter head, but the top of the knife on the cutter head is the same height as this out-feed table, so that when you run your piece across, it cuts a little bit off, and then it's supported by the out-feed table as it goes across. So we set that up, and then you want to make sure as you're running your piece, you go from this right-hand side to the left, and it cuts a little bit off. Using the joiner is very much about technique. It's about keeping your piece balanced and keeping it going in a straight line. It's relatively simple to use once you get it all set, but if you're not using it correctly, you can actually make the problem on your board worse. Now, as we get ready to run our piece across the joiner, you always want to make sure that this dust collection port is open. If you don't, all the shavings wind up collecting down below, and at a certain point, they wind up spitting backwards. What that'll do is it'll collect on top of the table, making it very difficult to get a clean cut because you have things in the way. Now, once the dust collector's open, you're ready to turn the power on. Once the power's on, you're going to have your hands I have my left hand pushing it so it's square against the fence, and my right hand on the back pushing down. I never want my hand to come directly over the cutter head. So I will move this way, move my hand around to support it, move my hand around to support it, and push it all the way through. The reason you don't want your hand over the cutter head is if you get your fingers in here, you can't put them back on. It will destroy your fingers. The joiner is designed for use on solid wood only. No plywood, no particle board. And the reason for that is that these two things don't have a true grain to them. And if you try and use them, they're going to wind up chipping out, tearing out. Because on plywood, some of the plies go one direction and the other plies go the opposite direction. So there isn't the true grain inside, so it won't join correctly. You'll either be tearing one piece or the other. So do not use it for plywood or particle board. Solid wood is just fine. And in here, we're just primarily focused on doing the edges. Some other things that you need to be aware of while you're using the joiner. Your pieces need to be 24 inches long. So if you're in doubt, if it isn't as long as this red mark, don't use the piece. The reason for 24 inches is that way you have enough room to move your hands around it and not have them over the cutter head. You also need to be going with the grain. So you can look at the surface here, be sure that you're going with the grain. If you try and go across the grain, one, the pieces are usually too short and so it's not safe. Pieces that are too short will come in here, dive in, and they'll kick back. The pieces, if you go across the grain, what can happen as you're cutting, the grain here, it'll come across and it'll cut flat. I'm not going to say it won't, but when you get to the end, if you don't have some sort of backer piece here, it'll break this off. And so instead of cleaning up the edge like you'd intended, you wind up breaking your piece off on the edge this side. If you need to clean up the edge, you should use the miter saw. So the joiner is a very loud machine. If the noise bothers you, you can always wear earplugs for hearing protection. So we reach down, green button turns it on. I'm going to do just like I said, move my hands this way and across. So, as you can see on this, it got most of the piece. It's flat down here, but this side needs a little bit more. So we'd run that a second time. Now, if you have a piece that's long enough to run through the joiner, but isn't as tall as the fence, it's still safe to run. Just be sure that you're using push sticks. You can have a push stick there so that you don't have to get your fingers in real close, and a push stick here on the end so that as it cuts, your hand can stay nice and far away.